Welcome to the event straight after morning tea. My name's John Sullivan, I'm from MYOB. I have the pleasure of introducing Mark Norton from Idiom. Mark comes with about 35 years experience in enterprise scale software. There's a great write-up on him here, but really the things you need to know is he's got a huge amount of experience, writes a lot of information out on the public blogs, web spaces. Really good guy to listen to. Idiom is an organisation, I know this is an Agile conference, they're not a transformation company, but they are a delivery company. But as everyone has heard all the way through this conference, transformation isn't really about sort of transforming yourself via a process, it's actually you get that through delivering, which is why it's worthwhile listening to this man and his presentation.
Thanks, John. Nice to see you all here. We're going to get into some bullshit bullets, but I promise you it'll be worth it. We work at the coalface. As John said, we're all focused on delivery here. We've been living and breathing Agile for a long, long time. But my purpose here really is to shift the focus of that conversation a little bit. Because an Agile process, if the Agile process is delivering the wrong result, it's not doing you any good. So I'm going to introduce a couple of use cases that give you a sense of the results that we're looking for. We're going to define Agile as being Agile for the business. The business has to see the result of agility and become an Agile business. Even if that was done in a traditional old waterfall fashion, it would still be worth it. But that's really the point, is to get business agility. Now these two use cases, both of them are insurance, so it kind of fits with the perpetual motion in financial products, but it doesn't have to be. Our customers include everything from government agencies to councils to Air New Zealand and others. But really there's bread and butter here, there's a lot of meat in this. Now this was one of the top 4 Australasian insurers. I'm talking about an actuary. Was a young guy I worked with for a little while. We had automated their credit policy, their underwriting policy, and he was working on his own through this process. He identified an area where the new policy was increasing the rate of referral required from one of their partners. And this is a problem for them, it's cost. So he worked through the process a little bit and found out what the issue was, figured he could change the underwriting policy so that it would mitigate this problem. He tested it. He found that it improved the overall flow. He went back through the channels because this has to be approved by the board. It has to be APRA approved. It's a very tedious process getting a major underwriting policy through the channels. And then he put it in production. He did all of that in 2 weeks by himself. No IT involvement at all. The second case is a very similar company. They have taken control, the underwriters and product managers in their organisation have taken control of the entire product development process. And when I say entire, I'm talking about the data. So they can define new data schemas, new business logic, new forms over the logic and the schemas, and new business documents at the other end. They can do the whole lot and deploy on a daily basis. Again, no IT. And the processing that's going through there is at the high end. This is not a simple form. We have forms and schemas there with thousands of fields per policy. Since I haven't mentioned who they are, I can mention there's at least one policy and there's got $11 billion of risk in it. So we're at the top end of town. This is complex stuff. Now, if that sort of agility is not what we're talking about, it's time for a cup of coffee. But I think that's really what everyone here will be trying to deliver. So even if we go Agile, we think there's some more serious problems under the covers. We've got a couple up there. Requirements are the first one. Requirements often still a narrative. Narrative means they're idiomatic. It also means they can't be tested. So they're kind of a story. A story that can't be tested, might as well call it a fantasy. We would be looking to deliver a complete application in less time than it takes most organisations to write the requirements. Throw away the requirements, you don't need them. I mean, you could even go down to what is a requirement, and that should be a discussion. It's a rhetorical question because we could be here all day. A requirement singular. Similarly with process. We think process is still a dominant concept in analysis. BPM's flavour of the month. And our view is that processes don't even exist. They're a waste of space. As an analysis subject, absolutely. They're the wrong place to start. If the process has no variable pathway through it, you just black box it and we call it an activity. If it does have a variable pathway, the only thing you need to know at any point in time is what's the best next step. If you always make the best next step, then you're always going to have an optimal process. But you can only see what the process was like in hindsight. So it's a bit like GPS. If I lay out 2 paths to Auckland and then take a wrong turning and end up in Wainui, a GPS is just going to say you need to get back on the highway. If your processes are laid out and are rigidly defined in a system, you're broken. So there's a couple of concepts from scratch that we think way down low, we need to throw them out and rebuild. Then there's another issue. I was going to call this, I think the concept this morning was strawberries and strawberry jam. That'll work for this. We take all of the business stuff and we mix it up with IT stuff, objects and platforms and other things. Once they're mixed up, it's like the strawberry jam. You can't get the strawberries back out. What that means is if I want to change one of the business items that's now all mixed up in the jam, it's actually an IT change that is relative to the size of the overall system. Every single change to the business becomes high-risk IT change. So you're going to go through the usually multi-month testing process and the whole code drop thing, and high cost, high risk, lots of time. So Agile can improve the process, but it doesn't actually solve the problem. So what I've laid out here so far is the objective has to be an Agile business. The fundamentals we're working with, we don't want to absorb them into the Agile process, being requirements and processes in particular, but there's also that issue of that system image which pulls everything together. We need to deal with that. I think most of this we can skip this slide, I think. So what we're doing now is this is really interesting in the sense that we have 2 terms up here, externalities and internalities. These actually came from a colleague we're working with in Melbourne in the banking industry. It's really surprising that there's no term that describes what we're talking about. The externalities are the real world things. Let's stick with our insurance example. We have insurance policies that have been around for hundreds of years. They're not connected to a system at all. In fact, they're not even connected to an insurance company. I can have an insurance policy and it's been around for hundreds of years, so they're perpetual, they're real, they can be quite tangible, and they're mutable because they're changing over time. These things just keep on moving. Real, perpetual, and mutable. Then we've got the internalities. These are the things that IT brings to the party. Remember the things that we've mixed into the jam. These things are the opposite. They're abstract. We can't actually see one. We can't hold one. They're transient. Windows 2003 is just gone. IMS FastPath, which I used to work with once upon a time, well gone. What happens is whole platforms simply move. They're gone, they're no longer there, no longer relevant, and they're inflexible. So we're mixing things into our jam. One is real, perpetual, and mutable. The other is abstract, transient, and inflexible. What we need to do is keep the real, perpetual, and mutable as real and perpetual and mutable inside that process. So what we end up talking about is the design of the application has to be agile. The thing we are building, whether we build it with an agile process or not, is moot. And we need the business to look after the business content in that application, and we need IT to look after the internalities. So this picture tries to give a little bit of a sense of what's going on. This view here is our traditional system. We have a single system image. It's not so much that there is only one image running on the platform, it's the fact that it is all intermingled. It's strawberry jam, it's not strawberries and sugar. What we need to do is to keep the strawberries separate. If we keep the strawberries separate and plug them into that container, then we can plug other fruit in. I think the analogy falls over completely, but the point is we can build them separately. There's an interesting side effect of that. That container is probably no more than 10% of the size of the code base that we're replacing. If we have 100% over here, this is 10%. In fact, was that same colleague in Melbourne did some work with the Royal Bank of Scotland, and they calculated that there were no more than 300 activities in the overall bank platform that you would have to rebuild to rebuild the whole bank. That's a large organisation. 300. We think 300's high because, as we're about to show you, if you build a transaction container that contains that business content, you can cut that down dramatically. If any of you have followed T. Capers-Jones, he was famous some years ago, but I think he's still around. He tracked tens of thousands of projects and absolutely conclusively proved that time, cost, and risk increase exponentially with system size. So if we reduce the size of the system from 100% to 10%, we've actually reduced the time, cost, and risk by 2 orders of magnitude. All of a sudden, things are starting to look really agile again. We're looking at building 2 insurance systems for 2 different players, possibly starting this month. We would expect to build the container in a month, and the system will be live within 2 to 3 months. Live, I don't mean finished. Those are pretty outstanding delivery rates, and that's from a standing start. Hasn't been approved yet. The process, you see we've eliminated it. The process is something you see in hindsight. It's always achieved by just calculating the best next activity. The system is always optimized. So with these externalities, they're kind of key to getting this right. This is the area that we play in mostly. We build the containers, but we don't need to. In fact, if you're lucky, you can actually turn an existing legacy application into a container, which means that you can now move forward, give it some agility, give it some flexibility, and eventually eat it out and replace it. That is happening. But the externalities that we need to plug in, we look at 4 models. You have to be able to describe the data. We typically do that with an XSD. So we define each transaction's data. The application does not need to know what that XSD looks like or contains. There's all the business policies that manage the state of that data. We describe that in what we call decision models. We need some dialogues, which is how we gather the event data that is going to change the state of the entity. And then we need to be able to put it onto a bit of paper or whatever for other actors. So we're going to produce an insurance document or whatever. With those 4 things, we can define complete business entities and life cycles. And we can build a system that doesn't know what they are. We have a customer in the insurance space now running in 10 countries who are planning to go into lending. we think we can do it without changing a line of code in the underlying system. So the entity data that describes our loan or our insurance policy or whatever, they can be large. The very first one we built for NZI in 2001 had 240,000 nodes. That's kind of normal. Getting above 1 million might be stretching it a bit, but that's the sort of thing we're talking about. The business policies, you might start to think they're pretty big too. We can get some really complicated stuff there. If you want to call by our stall, I can go into some of those stories. But it's quite plausible for a decision model that's doing a complex bit of logic, a defined benefit scheme. Health billing's pretty complicated. Some of this stuff will actually generate more code than the entire container. So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of lines of code coming out of those decision models. The process management, we've kind of hammered a little bit. Best next is all you need. That comes out of the decision model. I've changed the state of this entity. What do I need to do next? In fact, it's not even just limited to me, the system. It's the whole world. What other systems need to be aligned with my new state? Once you start thinking like that, your new policy-driven decision model is now managing the universe. It becomes the source of truth for the entire organization. So it's not just my system, it's the ledger, it's the legacy system, it's the partner system, etc., etc. The internalities, well, that's all your traditional IT stuff. But increasingly, it's really interesting. We're getting a convergence with the guys upstairs. There's Rivera and HP and IBM are all now offering these platforms. The platforms increasingly have all of the internalities in them. In fact, all we need is the virtual transaction platform, which we're about to talk about, that we can plug this business into to sit in the cloud, and we would be able to set up businesses on the fly. In fact, that's almost in play with these insurance systems I'm talking about. If we actually put up the internality platform, a generic system product, insurance product container, and ran it in one of the clouds, it would be available for anyone to put insurance products into. So all of a sudden, the IT aspect of it is becoming much more commoditized and irrelevant to the overall build process. But we do need that virtual transaction platform. And just think of it like a VM, right? A VM runs your application. What we want is a particular process that will run a complete life cycle for an entity, one that it doesn't actually know about. So I couldn't do a cartoon for this, but I didn't know about cartoons until yesterday. But the externalities are more specific instances of the internalities. I mean, we're at the coalface. I'm going to show you the database for this in a minute. And I can show you several examples of real databases that are built on this thing where the entity-specific schemas sit inside a generic database as a column in a table. So it's just an XML data type. So the whole database can now be built not knowing what it's containing. Similarly with the business decisions and business policies, we can build the decision models. Actually, we often keep them in the database as well. Literally, the binary sits in a column and we'll load from the database. Data mappings, if we're going to connect to any other machine, well, what we do is we're going to use a decision model to create some data that is already proprietary to that system and say, please pass that on. Give this message to that legacy system. It knows what to do with it. All generic. So the externalities know about customers and products and services, and all the internalities know about is activities. So for instance, if I put in a new activity that says I can send an SMS message, then all of a sudden a model can say, oh, we can now do SMS, so it's really important when we're going to bill this customer that we send them an SMS message. Generate the message text, put it on a queue and say send it there. So now we've just blended together the internalities and the externalities and show how they kind of work with that example. So the externalities now are nimble, continuous, and perpetual change. That's the words used by one of our insurance customers who was speaking for us in Australia. That was his catchphrase for what we've achieved with their insurance products. And that's being achieved with no IT. Whereas the infrequent, the disruptive, and the wholesale change, that's an IT stuff, that's an engineering issue. Evolutionary and revolutionary. So I promised to get kind of practical and show you this database. This blue stuff, that's where we hold the models. It's more or less complete. We have the forms, the archetype is the schemas. We have the forms, the decision models. You can actually see the binary there. And we just have a class loader that will read from the database, which gives you the benefit of being able to version stuff and manage it, but that's all being managed. Right through to the documentation. That entity XML there, that's the subject matter. It can be an insurance policy, it could be a loan, it could be a patient, a passenger, a taxpayer. We're using exactly the same pattern. We're talking to, at the moment, the government of South Australia for entitlement calculations. They took one look at this pattern and said, that's really interesting. And so they're talking with a few of our referees this week. Because entitlements can go in there. Just the pattern, what we're doing with this entity here, we'll put enough extra columns in that table so that we can index onto it and find our entity. So however many indexes you want is how many columns you'll have. And every time we touch that XML, we're going to put a copy of it here. We'll probably compress it and just put it down here as well. So now we've got continuous history automatic. We similarly will keep the documents, the document binary itself. This example here is the sort of example where we would generate entries for another system. In this particular case, it was targeted at Sage. So what happens is we're going to go through a process, we've changed state. Did we change the value? Yep, we're going to have to charge some money or whatever. So we generate the entries inside our decision models. We generate the entries and say, give these to Sage. So we're controlling the financials. Similarly with the legacy system, similarly with the third-party systems, we generate what they need to know because we've got the flexibility, they haven't. And all that happens is when the container writes that XML, it says, are there any things in here for other systems that I know about? This is a metadata issue. Oh, there is. There's some financial entries. In that case, I'll strip them off. I'm going to put them in my database or put them on a queue or whatever I'm going to do. Workflow, we mentioned next best. If the next best step is in the future, I can't execute it now. So we'll create a bring up. Again, we put the bring up in here, and when we write that XML, have I got any bring ups in here? Oh, I have. Create them. So a bring up, in this sense, is a future dated event. In similar vein, the next best step might be a human require an operator intervention. It might not be automated. If it's automated, it's going to be done to a web service or a queue, whatever it is. So we can create actions. Again, the actions are created in here, stripped out and put in here. So these things have no UI over them, but they're going to drive the process. Now I can put these two together and run an entire organization quite smoothly. For instance, I've got my insurance policy, it's going to renew in a year's time. In 10 months' time, I want to send a letter to the customer to say I'm going to do that. So I have a bring up for 10 months' time. That process jumps up, says, oh, what process am I? I want that entity ID on that entity type. There's the ID there. I want to pull that out because you're due for a renewal. So we then generate a document, send it off to the customer. And we set another bring up, now for a few weeks later, so we can send a reminder. we still haven't been updated, so we might set another bring up that if I haven't had a renewal notice from the customer by this time, I'm going to generate an action that someone's going to ring them. And then we can even set another bring up to make sure they did ring them. So you can actually just interplay these two things so that we're managing manual workflow, automatic workflow, and we need nothing more than this database to do the whole lot. So plugging it all together, this is what that container might look like now. So what happens is we start here, we go right round, and we kind of updated the picture a little bit. It comes right back down again. An event happens, whether that's a batch, whether it's a person turning up on the internet, a CSR over there. The container says, I've got an event, I don't know what to do with it. We obviously have to get to a point where we've identified the policy, we've identified the loan, we've identified the customer, whatever. So then we pull that one out of the database. If there isn't one in the database, we create a new one. That's fine. So now we have inside the container all of our models that are able to process this thing, no matter what the event is. But they're going to decide what's the event. I mean, I might have opened it up for an endorsement, but I'm 2 days away from renewal. So the decision models will decide whether it's going to renew or whether it's going to do an endorsement. And as you can see, we'll go through here. We might ask some questions, because that's the dialogue I mentioned. We'll do some validations and transformations. We'll then decide what we're going to do in terms of the state change. This is the actual, so we're renewing. Because we've done that state change, we're going to do a whole bunch of stuff here that is required to align the world with the fact that we've now changed the state of this thing. And then we'll look after our own workflow there. And we put it all back. It doesn't matter what the transaction is, and it doesn't matter what the entity is, this container will service it. We may be requesting data from other systems, but that's fine. I need a credit check, okay? So I create this little bit of metadata that the container says, he wants a credit check. We've got 3 credit check options. We'll do this one, and this one. So this brain is actually controlling the entire process. So where have we got to here? What we think we've achieved with it, actually it's not what we think. This has been demonstrated and we've got a bunch of referees who will attest to it. The binary BPM works. That's really key. No business process management. Automate the now, it's kind of a little catchphrase that turned up at some point. What we're trying to say is there's no point in looking into the future of what the process might look like because it's irrelevant. If you're doing the next best step, the only time you know what that next best step is right now, when you have context right now. So don't worry about it. The business that's doing the modelling, that's understanding that I have these capabilities and here's what I need to do, will look after that. We want to align the entire system of dependent systems and actors with this new state. So we reach we no longer work within companies. Just about all of our systems now cross company boundaries. And that's perfectly normal. But when we generate updates for these systems, we don't know what that system does with the update. So the actual process can go on ad infinitum. We actually don't know, nor do we need to know. Timeliness and accuracy, that's really connected to that best next step. Just reduce the scope to a dialogue. I've got the answers to these 3 questions. What's the next best questions to ask? So we need to ask them, so we actually manage the interactions and get exactly the right answers at the right time. We use that process to change the metadata of forms and things so that we can actually say, you're a gold card customer, you're allowed access to this capability. Or you're a senior customer services rep, so you can do this. but we just changed the metadata, and it's business controlled. Here's a key issue, expanded transaction scope. We are looking at the entire life cycle of this entity. If you go into an insurance business, do we have anyone in insurance here? Okay, if you go into an insurance business, typically people would see renewal as a bigger, distinct process. In fact, when I mentioned the idea of doing this insurance system starting this month, the sponsor said, oh, maybe we can cut a bit of time and cost if we take out renewals. And we said, well, actually, unfortunately, no, it'll make no difference whatsoever, because we'll just treat renewal. There may be a couple of little branches in a decision that says, if it's a renewal, cap the rate at this. But that's it. Otherwise, the process inherently manages every state change. So we're not building anything for renewal any more than we are for endorse or cancel or anything else. And so in many cases, that approach alone substantially reduces the size of the build. I mentioned that we take a history every time. That's just best practice. We don't have to. But if you imagine the dialogue that I mentioned, we're doing the next question, the next set of questions, We're just going to take a copy of that and put it along with the XML as we store it. So now we've got the whole non-repudiation, the complete history of the interaction with the customer or the CSR or whatever. We've got all of the logic of the state change, the approval process, the calculation of the amounts. All of that cost us nothing. All that happened was when we wrote it back to the database, the system, the internalities, the container, simply picked a copy up and put it in another table. Virtually free. Business and systems alignment. That's kind of moving up the food chain a little bit. This is for people who actually care about whether we actually started to build a system. It started down this approach many years ago with a New Zealand insurer, and they wanted us to automate some commercial insurance for them. And we went in, they gave us the manual, and we talked to the underwriters. Actually cancelled the project in the end because the underwriters won. In that case, they didn't want it automated. They didn't follow the manual at all. There was zero connection. In fact, some of them didn't know it existed. So the idea that your business policy can be markedly different from what's happening in the field is real, and increasingly dangerous. I read somewhere recently that the amount of fines currently, since 2008, for mis-selling to customers is $260 billion US and climbing. So regulators in slightly more regulated regimes than we are, APRA in Australia, for instance, start to look really hard. If you've got a documented underwriting policy, you better be following it. We actually have an insurer now who has integrated what we're doing into their policy definition process. Remember we talked about requirements, and don't bother to write requirements, just throw it away. What we do is start to build out a new policy, a new product. Let's say it's a new insurance product. We want to do something slightly different. So the people who are using our decision modeling are the business. These are the guys who own the products, who are responsible for the financial performance of the products. So they'll make some changes. And then we'll run it across the existing portfolio and see if those changes do what they want. And they'll tune it and they'll play around with it. Remember the actuary in the very first slide. That was essentially what he was doing. He would rerun the entire credit policy across their 500,000 current policies. And he was able to start to play with it. We go a little bit further, we can run the old policy and the new policy. We're overusing policy, aren't we? It's a problem with insurance. The old business policy and the new business policy over their complete portfolio of business. And now we can start to diff them. If I give you a different example, we're trying to talk Auckland Council into doing that with rates. Next year's rates, they really get a bit sensitive about the fact that people's rates went up $10,000. So we could run next year's rating policy and last year's rating policy across the same portfolio of properties and actually look at the differences on a property-by-property basis to make sure they're getting what they want. Maybe they should cap them to $9,999 increases. But being able to play with those policies and refine the business decision-making that's inside them, when they get it right, they will then generate the logical English out of the model and plug that into a narrative, which is what APRA will see and what is signed off. So we're actually turning it around, and the system is actually becoming the requirement source and is pushing back into we're generating the requirements document after the fact. It's a bit like our process idea. You can only see it in hindsight. So once that's done, then it's approved. This is a regulatory thing in Australia in particular. Then they press the button and it's all generated. Now there are no fingerprints between that document and what's running in production. So now the people who signed off on it at the board level end can be absolutely confident that that's what's happening out there. I suggest right now there's not many of them are that confident. And increasingly, they're liable for the difference. Perpetual agility. The company I mentioned that has taken total control of their product development inside their underwriting team are able to deal with the entire process daily. We actually suggested strongly that there be a manual process in there with one purpose, to make sure they've done due process on their testing and certification and sign-off. They have a platform they can regression test the whole thing. So we're able to say, here's the new one, here's the differences you expect, mask them out, are there any other differences? This is the decimal point problem, just something I didn't intend to do. This is not broken software, I just did something that I didn't quite think out. And I want to find that before I put it into production. So there's a whole bunch of reassurance that you can do to make sure that when it goes to production, it's absolutely fail-safe. But if someone doesn't do that, press the button and it's there. I remember IBM did that once, and they had a whole bunch of PCs up for $250, and they honoured it too. It was many years ago. And they sold $500,000 worth of PCs very cheap. And it was just that sort of accident. So you need a manual process, I think, that just says, I'm going to check that you did everything that you're supposed to have done before you gave this to me. Now I'll let it go. And that's it. Now, the perpetual agility, we actually have in place processes where, should they change their underlying data schema, remember they have control of the data. They can add new fields, they can have a new schema, they can set up completely new business if they want, and all they need to do is build a new schema. But if they change a schema and they need to take an old version of the schema and renew that policy under a new version of rules, we automatically pipeline it through. So we can actually update the schema on the fly. So it's continuously refreshing. In fact, we've got another example where we refresh it every time we touch it. So what's happening is that under the covers, the system is automatically migrating their data forward every time that they make a change to that schema. Extensible, so they can plug in, I've gone over that, I guess. Now the legacy rejuvenation, if we're lucky, you can put this into an existing system. Most existing systems have a limited purpose. Most of them are pretty promiscuous. They allow lots of things to happen, subject to your seniority. So long as we plug in and give that system what it needs, it's going to be perfectly happy. But don't add to it, because we can do it all on the outside. When its purpose becomes pointless, and there's a number of systems out there that, particularly in insurance, who I think have way outlived their usefulness, just switch it off. We got the data copied elsewhere, but you can keep these things going for as long as it's useful. If your old policy system is still doing the reinsurance, well, good luck, leave it there. So we're either rejuvenating legacy systems or eating them out and replacing them. So I think we can, at this point, we can either stop or not stop. This was just saying, if I wanted to start to build it, there's just 2 slides here, and it's more or less the end of it. If I wanted to start building this, a transaction, what am I going to do? That's what that transaction container is going to do. But I think we're into bullshit bullets. I'm not sure you want to read all those things. But having done those things, and that's a standard cycle. It doesn't matter what entity is, what the transaction is. It's changing the state. Here's just a little observation. We still have one system image actually executing in the platform. It's just now in 2 discrete parts that we're managing independently. That, I think, if there's anything to take away from this, if you can do that, you'll have an agile business. More importantly, if you can't do that, it's going to be very broken for a long time. That jam is really dangerous, mixing all of your business stuff into the underlying IT components and nonsense. And you need to keep them separate. Mainly because they move in 2 completely different motivations, 2 completely different life cycles, and you'll never be able to address either side cleanly. You want to change from WebSphere to Fusion or to Microsoft or whatever, you should be able to do that. We actually generate both Java and .NET, and we actually have had a customer switch. It's not a problem. It is if you've got one system image that you have coded at that level. I think I'm done.
Are there any questions from the floor?
Oh,
Right at the back.
Just through the presentation, the example you started with the business kind of buying, etc. What was a compelling event for the business to really, I guess, adopt behind a problem that solved this concept that you just presented?
which example slide? Was there one in particular you're thinking of?
You mentioned around business agility and the adoption of, keep extracting out of that business stuff they need to do from into your IT system and stuff like that.
I think in each case we have, well, the second one's probably clearer. The first one, if I look at those 2 use cases in the beginning, I can probably talk in reasonable detail because I haven't mentioned who they are, which is good now. One of them, the first one, they replaced an application called Decision Point from Vida, and it was broken as far as they were concerned. So they were in the market looking for an application. This approach actually is usually faster and cheaper than buying an existing application, believe it or not. Right? That's happened time and time again. So we went into there in 2005 or 6, and then we upgraded the whole thing onto this kind of pattern in 2012, which is when my actuary friend went through that process, which we didn't even know about. That 2-week story is just amazing. But the other company actually was managing its really complex products. What happens is they have a platform that manages kind of products that have a very stable pattern because they're retail and there's millions of them. But they tend to be simple. This probably goes along with the turf. They're more complex products, where I mentioned one with an $11 billion risk. It's actually 1,000 schools in a single policy. Right? That doesn't fit the standard pattern. They have to do something different to support business like that. They were doing it on spreadsheets. You know, you've got spreadsheets with 3 million cells that take, you know, 8 gig of memory before you can even open it. And these spreadsheets were in the market. So they send, oh, here's our current spreadsheet for this sort of business, send it out to all agents and brokers. Managing versioning, you can imagine, was a little bit. But it got to the point where the regulators saying, this is not acceptable. Right? So they had to get off the spreadsheets. And those spreadsheets have been around a while, and there was lots of them. We're talking 70 products. So we pulled all the logic out of the spreadsheets, put a form over the top. We thought we'd have multiple schemas. What we've actually done is just had one big schema, and each product, because there's so much overlapping stuff between these products, you know, the underlying risks are kind of the same thing. If you've got 1,000 schools, the fact that you're dealing with property carries a certain, you know, it's got risk profile, it's got flood risks, it's got fire risks, it's got this and that. So you can deal with property the same way, no matter whether it's this sort of policy or that sort of policy. So what we did was we've ended up with one big schema which says, well, here's all the property bits, here's all of the terrorism bits, here's all of these bits, and you can kind of mix and match it and just use the bits you need on any given product. And that's worked quite well. So now you just see the bits you need for this product, and the rules will say, oh, yeah, I need to do a terrorism calculation for this one. Oh, I've got all these properties, yeah, I'll add them up, I'll look up the risk thing and whatever. So the prime motivator there was Excel replacement, and it was regulator driven. But I'm sure the business was concerned in its own right.
Anyone else would like to ask a question?
Can you tell us a bit about the process by which you arrived at that architecture?
Yeah, but it's a bit of a long journey. It actually starts at Databank up the road. We started at Databank, and Databank was kind of a big noise in the early 80s. And we started to get into model-driven development. You might not know it here, but do you know the products Irwin and what's the other data modeling tool? They actually came out of Databank. But in the early 90s, we were using quite vigorously a product called Sign-On, which was a model-driven development environment building systems on the AS400. That was hugely effective. But come 1997, and we've got the internet, we've got XML, and we've got virtual machine-based languages, and that whole world just went away. So what we tried to do was recover what was really the secret. So where did we get the value out of that model-based approach and sign-on? I mean, if you know function points, we generated whole systems. There's an Auckland University study, soup to nuts, concept to production at 30 minutes a function point in 1991. So it was very effective, but it all went away because no one wanted RPG systems anymore, which is kind of hard to imagine, isn't it? But what was really the important bit there? The important bit was that we could put the business logic inside components that were black boxed and remained the business logic, even though you generated the code. So that was the birth of Idiom, right? To try and recover that ability. It's not actually about rules per se, we kind of got boxed into that. It was actually about being able to model the business logic that sits in your applications and keep it discrete. That's where we started. So that's the first 10 years was probably of that pattern. We got New Zealand Customs, we got NZI, Allianz, Air New Zealand, a bunch of companies that was perfectly fine for. Ministry of Health. In 2010, we got into an interesting situation where we had a company. Is the Temenos gentleman here? Go on, or I'm about to say something about Temenos, who had a Temenos back end, and they weren't actually looking to replace it, but they needed to add substantial amount of value to it. And they gave us carte blanche to build a system. So this is absolute green fields. No IT department, no architects, just us. So we built them a complete insurance system, which is currently running in 10 countries in 2 man years. Less than $500,000. That's when we put all these patterns into place, and they work on a large scale. I mean, tens of millions of policyholders. In fact, we're just doing some work right now because they want to onboard 42 million policies a day. They come out of telcos that are in third world countries. So you get this, we had the chance to actually build that whole approach from scratch and get it working, make it work. And we've never done anything since. Now, that's all we do. That pattern is just so powerful. I mean, literally 2 orders of magnitude, if you're lucky, reduction in cost and time. Certainly one, but incredible business agility that comes with it. Just continuous change forever, including whole platform changes if you need it. So we don't do anything else now. But we're not actually system builders. That's not our, we're not in the services business. We tend to do services, but that's because we need to do services around our own products. But the pattern works and it's powerful. You can take it and use it. The message I can give you here is that that approach works. It doesn't matter how you build it. You can do it with other tools. I could suggest other tools if you really want to use other tools as well. So it's not proprietary in any way, but it is powerful and it does work. Did I get there?
So we probably have time for another question if anyone has one. I'll run.
So, I mean, I guess you're effectively separating out business logic and you're modelling that against your business processes. What happens when you have a transformative change in your business? Because you've still got to update your business model, so you've still got an IT change around that. How does this enable that real agility?
I mean, I think you're into really interesting territory here. Once you see the business completely separately from the IT stuff, the business is just in a perpetual state of change. I'm not quite sure what you mean by a transformative change. I can only associate that with the idea of some sort of system replacement or something. The businesses tend to evolve and they change every day. If there's a transformative change, it might be an additive change, i.e. we're going to go into a new business, maybe we'll drop this one off, but it's kind of a progressive thing. The idea of them stopping doing something and then starting up a new business in effect and that looks different, I find that hard to imagine. However, what we've found is that our whole modelling paradigm, and this is hindsight, not foresight, we didn't set out to do this, is actually powerful enough that we could take, we've got a case where we read a 1 million member, 1 billion row table, a database in Melbourne that has a total value of around $40 billion, and we validate it every day in 2 hours on an i7. Now, the idea of being able to read that amount of data, 22 tables in a join, we've since expanded it. We're now joining somewhere around 47 tables, and we're masking that whole database and writing it back out again. Now, the idea of reading in a system in one format, transforming it, and writing it out in another format I've just described. And we do that more or less every day for 1 million people on a big scale system. So if we really needed to transform, we would do so. In fact, we're doing one right now where we're going to transform the shape of the XML. It's our insurance one, our Greenfields one. We're going to change the shape of the XML for all existing business. And that's tens of millions of things, and it's going to take a little bit of a while. But we're going to read it all out, change it, write it all back again. We're doing it right now, actually. So we do have the ability to do large-scale change. In fact, there's a whole business potentially around remediation. We've just remediated a major government payroll in New Zealand for 10 years. Had to fix up data, so that's a case of taking in data that is broken, fix it up, and recalculate the payroll for 10 years. So we can do those things, but I'm not sure they're really business-driven in the sense of a business-driven transformation. But if you've got some examples, I'd be happy to talk about them. If it's a system change, you just pick up the business stuff, change the system, put it back down again. Regenerate it if you need to.
I guess my question was more around, so you mentioned at the beginning of your talk that the IT part is perceived as being slow to change, high risk.
Yeah.
Is this business then sort of just shifting from kind of up the stack that from the actual perspective of the outcome?
Oh, no, there was one study we did, well, we didn't do it, a partner did it actually. They did a Greenfields build and we were part of it. The stuff that we were building was, we are 80% of that system image, i.e. the lines of code, and it was generated 20 times faster than the traditionally coded stuff, 20 times. So because of the tools, if you look at a brochure, you'd have to come and get one, but the fact that we have context awareness in the tools, the fact that it's all drag and drop, the fact that it's self-testing, the fact that there's no requirements, so the SME themselves are building the models, all of this speeds up that process incredibly and makes it very safe. So the business is building all of this stuff in a fraction of the time that it's traditionally done in. Literally, less time than it takes to write the requirements, literally. And it's far more concise and it's provably correct, and then you press the button and get it into production for zero cost. So it's not apples and apples. The IT side is still however it was. Maybe they're even more consciously aware of engineering well, but they're only dealing with 10% of the problem. So their job has shrunk dramatically. So the bit that we've given to the business, they actually didn't increase the size of the team at our customer where they took it over. They didn't increase the size of the team at all. And now they do all of the product development themselves. What they were doing before in requirements and testing via the IT path, the traditional path, they're actually doing less work doing it themselves now. So the work's gone down, and the IT side is just gone. They don't do anything. In that case.
Okay. And then with that last question, we'll draw the session to a close. Please thank Mark for his presentation.
Thank you.
Well done.